Welcome to week 8 of the social psychology of work. This week, we'll finally be transitioning away from Goffman's dramaturgy and towards social identity theory. The last 5 weeks of the course will explore different dimensions of social identity and the ways in which our individual identities depend on group membership. I hope you enjoy the final stretch of this course. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Irving. As Irving just said, we are now entering week 8 of the social psychology of work, where we will be transitioning away from Goffman's dramaturgy and in the direction of social identity theory. So there are some similarities, some differences between these two paradigms, and the differences and similarities should become apparent over the next series of lectures. But before I begin, I just want to give you a basic understanding of what is meant by social identity theory. Okay? So probably the best way to summarize this theory is with a little illustration. So let's say that that is me. All right. So as with any other approach to social psychology, the question is, what constitutes myself, right? What makes me who I am today? And what the social identity theorist argues is that the individual and the individual's identity is a function of his or her wider group memberships, okay? So how do I identify? Well, first of all, I am a man, right? So the fact that I'm a man suggests that there's another group out there somewhere called men. Okay, so these are a couple men here. Right? And within this group called men, there are a series of normative behaviors, and these normative behaviors inform my behavior as a man. But of course, I'm not just a man, right? We have multiple identities according to social identity theory. So what else am I? I am a professor. Okay, so that suggests that there's a group of people somewhere out there in the world called professors. And this group of people tends to behave in a certain way, tends to think in a certain way, tends to act in a certain way. And the norms underlying this group also inform my identity as a professor. But it doesn't stop there. Right? There are endless numbers of social groups that we belong to. And within each one of those social groups, we learn how we should act, how we should think, and how we should behave based on those norms. So I'm also, in terms of my nationality, I'm an American. So that suggests that there's a group of people out there called Americans, and that I probably learn a bit about myself and who I am in relation to that group membership. And actually, I'm quite close to becoming an Australian citizen now. So that assumes that there's a group of people out there somewhere called Australians, and Australians tend to think, act, and behave in a certain way. And when I become an Australian, then that will constitute some of my identity. Okay, so you can kind of see where this is going. Social identity theory assumes that there are a myriad of social groups out there in the social world. And within those groups, there are established norms for thinking and behaving. And when we identify with these groups, we take a part of those groups and internalize them, right? So the individual is essentially a product of his or her relationship to these wider social groups, okay? So with this background in mind, I now am ready to proceed into this week's lecture. And I hope you enjoy it, because it begins now. Let's talk a bit about social identity theory.
At its most basic form, social identity theory, also commonly referred to as SIT, that's SIT, is another framework that we can use to think about the development of the self. Whereas Goffman argued that the self depends on the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in, social identity theory assumes that the self depends on the social groups with which we define. Thus, we are merely a reflection of the groups that we belong to, whether that includes race, gender, nationality, political party, sexual orientation, or whatever other categories that we identify with. So, what makes us human? Well, it's the ability to categorize and to classify. This is what we do naturally. We develop categories to describe and understand our reality, both material and social. If you think about it, the whole concept of language is based on classification and categorization. We look at the world and we divide it up into things that are similar or different. One big concept might be, for example, people. And then we divide up that concept into different categories: white people, black people, tall people, short people, nice people, mean people, right handed people, left handed people. The list really goes on and on and on. Or take another concept like food. We categorize that into typologies, right? There's fruit, vegetables, meat, dairy, carbohydrates, and each one of those categories can be further subdivided, right? Different fruits include strawberries, blueberries, peaches, apples, oranges, etc. We classify everything: animals, modes of transportation, genres of literature, you name it. This is how we make sense of the world. We create categories and place things inside of them so that we can distinguish between the things that we see. We make sense of the world through the categories that we assign and the categories that are assigned to us. The concept of social identity theory is all about categorization. Philosophically, it's based on the idea of structuralism, which means that a thing has no intrinsic meaning, and its meaning only derives from its relationship with other things. Thus, for example, a table only has meaning because it is not a chair, a book, or a glass. The same structuralist logic applies to social identity theory. The individual only has meaning and identity because of his or her relationship with other groups or categories of people. Social identity theory derives largely from the pioneering work of Henry Tajfel, although other major players in the field include, for example, Michael Hogg, John Turner, Dominic Abrams, and Deborah Terry, among others. In this class, we will be focusing on the contributions of Tajfel to social identity theory. So Tajfel was a social psychologist, right? Not just a psychologist, but a social psychologist. And he was highly critical of the individualism associated with cognitive psychology, right? So a cognitive psychologist focuses on how intrinsic personality shapes an individual's identity, whereas a social psychologist like Tajfel argues that one's identity can only be understood in the context of wider, large-scale social processes. The social psychologist argues that the individual and his or her autonomy is just a myth. As individuals, we are really no different from animals with instincts driving our behavior. It is only because we are embedded in wider social structures that we have a human identity. In other words, we are who we are only by virtue of our relationship to others. it necessarily follows that if we associate and identify with different groups of people, our own identity changes. Thus, different cultures and times across history can shape the same person in different ways. We take on different languages, values, norms, religious beliefs, etc., based on the society in which we are embedded. There's an old Spanish proverb that goes something like, Dime con quién andas y te digo quién eres. This translates into, tell me who you walk with, and I'll tell you who you are. This is really the core assumption of social identity theory, that we are blank slates that are shaped by our surroundings. Conceptually, there are three levels of analysis that are relevant to the social identity theorist: the individual level, the inter-individual level, and the intergroup level. The individual cannot exist on his or her own. As a thought experiment, imagine a scenario where there is only one human being in the world. That person would not be a human being technically. Without others, there would be no scope for communication. Without communication, there is no meaning. Now, the social identity theorist argues that the individual simultaneously shapes society and is also shaped by society. We learn who we are through normative frames of reference, but we also contribute to those normative frames of reference through our behaviors. We are born, for example, boys or girls. We are labeled by others as boys or girls, and we conform to what it means to be a boy or a girl. And when we conform to these ideals, the ideals of, for example, masculinity, right? Boys don't cry, or femininity, for example, girls should play with dolls, we reinforce those societal and group norms. We, as individuals, become socialized into groups through our daily interactions. We relate to each other in terms of our group membership. That's a black guy. That's a white girl. That's an Asian guy. That's a Muslim girl. We internalize the norms of those groups and assume that others have internalized those norms as well. What's more, the groups themselves develop relationships at the intergroup level, right? A white man and an Aboriginal man interact with each other not just as men, but as members of their respective ethnic group. So the job of the social identity theorist is to unpack those inter-individual and intergroup relationships in order to understand the individual and his or her place in what is a very categorized world. When individuals reject the social categories that are commonly agreed upon by society, for example, male and female, the result is often conflict over defining the terms of one's identity, as demonstrated by the growing non-binary community and their struggle for a more nuanced identity beyond men and women. As you watch this video, have a think about its implications for gender identity.
Just because I may present more femme doesn't mean that I'm any less they, them.
You know what, that thing where you're eating a meal but you're not really eating a meal, you're just kind of picking at food on the counter. My family and I were doing that one night, and I just kind of looked at them and said, hey guys, I'm non-binary. I don't have a gender.
In my opinion, gender is a universe. It is a broad spectrum of planets and stars and sky that truly cannot be contained into a binary.
My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and that's a non-negotiable. And they were all kind of like, okay.
I think one of the main reasons pronouns are so important is because other than our name, it's one of the main ways that people identify and call us.
My pronouns are personally very important to me. Growing up, enculturated into kind of a system that really subscribes to toxic masculinity, I was always uncomfortable with being called dude, what's up, man. I was so bad at dapping people up, like, how, like, guys, like, do that whole, like that thing. I was so bad at that, and it just, like, I felt very alienated every time someone would do that to me.
So when someone identifies with a pronoun, they're essentially taking their little piece of that broad universe and identifying with that. And so in using their correct pronouns, we're validating that yes, you are right in your identity and you are important and we're respecting you.
Coming into terms with my gender queer identity has been one of the most challenging but also rewarding things that I've done.
Laverne Cox kind of famously said, misgendering a trans person is an act of violence. And it is. It's an act of psychological violence. It's a denial of somebody's personhood and a complete refusal to acknowledge their identity, whether intentional or not.
And so it is something that is entirely wrapped around our everyday lives. So just walking into a restaurant and hearing someone say she, like, will happen within 2 seconds of me entering, which doesn't happen about any of my other identities. They're not going to be like, oh, you straight person, like that doesn't happen. But automatically someone will make assumptions about gender, which translate into pronouns, which mean that I will hear over and over again people saying something about my identity which is false.
I think a lot of people associate expression with identity, and sometimes that's not the case. Oftentimes I'm in situations where I'm not the most safe being able to express my gender identity, and in those cases, even in those instances where I'm wearing basketball shorts or sneakers, you can't take my gender identity away from me because that's mine and not yours.
So many different options for who you are and how to define that. So when someone chooses a personal pronoun that they identify with, using that pronoun is a form of respect and a form of validation that, yes, this is your rightful identity and I will respect that.
And I know personally when I get misgendered, by strangers it's one thing, but it's especially painful when it's people who are close to you. So when my parents misgender me, it's a knife in my heart because they're the people whose opinions matter more to me than anybody else's.
And not knowing how to combat it. It is constant, and it is such a prevalent part of our society that being misgendered happens countless times in a day, and that builds up really quickly, and it can really be difficult for a person to hear over and over again because it invalidates your identity over and over and over again.
Pronouns are important because they are the smallest and easiest way that you can acknowledge somebody's identity.
And I also don't like that people call them their preferred pronouns because it's also not a preference. It's who they are. You need to use those pronouns. It's literally an extension of my arm or my leg. It's just as a part of me as a vital organ. My identity, although you can't see it, still needs to be validated just as much as you would validate the fact that I have 5 fingers or 5 toes.
A good inquiry into social identity theory rests on 3 foundations. These are 1, understanding the processes of social categorization, 2, understanding social identity itself, and 3, understanding the concept of social comparison. Let's take each of these elements of SIT one at a time. With regard to social categorization, we must define social groups and understand the patterns, regularities, and uniformities within and between groups. So what does this mean? A social group must hang together and share some commonality and experience. We could artificially create any number of arbitrary groups, but they're not real social groups unless they are defined as such by the larger society. Now, with regard to social identity, we must explain how group membership influences the individual. In other words, we must understand how the individual internalizes traits and behaviors that derive from an externalized but homogeneous group. What does it mean to be a black man? How is that different from a white man, or a black woman, or even a black transgender woman? Membership in each of these groups is going to regulate how we think and how we behave. Finally, with regard to social comparison, we need to understand how some groups are advantaged and dominant in society, and other groups are disadvantaged and subordinate. As a result, we often see cooperation within groups and competition and conflict between groups. According to Tajfel, a good social psychologist speaks to all three of these points in any analysis of social identity. Okay, at this point, I'm now going to hand it back to Irving, my avatar, so that he can tell you about this week's online forum activity. When you've completed the activity, don't forget to return for part 2 of the Week 8 lecture, where we'll be describing some classic experiments in social psychology. See you in a bit.